Thank you so much, Morgane. Thank you so much, Yosra, for this wonderful welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here with you this evening and to be in this beautiful city to talk with you and to have a dynamic conversation, hopefully, about the situation of women in water. But first, let me quickly introduce myself. I work in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in the Global Water Program at the headquarters in Switzerland. But my work, I'm very fortunate, has taken me to Africa, Latin America, Asia, North Africa as well. It's the first time I actually come here to Jordan. But these experiences have really been very useful to feed our knowledge about the practice of water and water governance in particular. And I work on several initiatives, but one is called BRIDGE, Building River Dialogue and Governance, and it's about building water governance capacity. And the reason I mention this is that as we've worked in BRIDGE over the years, we've noticed that, in fact, women have taken on very interesting leadership roles at multiple levels of governance. And that is too often under-recognized and unseen for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into shortly. But in our work with many partners on the ground and partners internationally, such as Oxfam, Saki Waters, Women for Water Partnership, and others, we've come to collect stories and cases about women leading change. And so this is what I was hoping to talk with you about this evening. One of the first things that we learn as we work in water is that gender, in fact, gender in water is a very nuanced topic. And Morgane, you were mentioning this before. So as I was saying, there have been efforts to become much more gender sensitive and gender responsive in the programs that are run, both in water and sanitation services and also in water resources management. But I'll give you an example that'll give you pause, I'm sure. There was one project in Western India which sought to alleviate the tremendous burden on women and children to fetch water for hours and hours. This is a common problem. We see it all around the world. This particular project installed public standpipes in the center of the villages so that women would be able to spend time doing other things and they wouldn't be walking for hours and also incurring other kinds of dangers. As we know, that's another issue with walking to fetch water. Well, ironically, once all of the pipelines, the standpipes were installed and the project was completed, there was a survey to understand what the outcome was for the women in this village. And what they found was that women were spending just as much time fetching water and bringing it back home. And why was that? Well, in fact, their husbands, who had in the past been used to going to the public baths, now, because the water was so readily available, they wanted to have baths in their own homes. And so more water was needed in each household for the comfort of the men in these households. So it's a nice example where you have a project that intends to do the right thing, but perhaps didn't take into account the more complex, subtle, nuanced, socio-cultural and political context that needs to be taken into account in the design of such projects. So, excuse me. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there's much work that we can do still to improve the way in which we think about gender in water, about women in water, about men in water, and there's a lot of ideas around that we need to start putting into practice. One of these ideas has, in fact, started being put in practice here in Jordan, and I was very impressed by this story. Training women plumbers to help address water use inefficiency and increase awareness about the resource. So this is a very interesting program that's been run now for a couple of years. I believe it's called Water Wise Women, but perhaps some in the audience can tell us more about this. But what I found really interesting about it is that it, takes into account a certain context, a certain sociocultural context in which, for example, a man plumber cannot go into a household if there's not another man present, and if it's only the housewife who's there to receive the plumber. So through this mechanism, there's now a way for women not only to take charge of fixing actual, very concrete issues, but also for them to gain skills to potentially become involved in a profession that traditionally they were not involved in, and to indeed also help to raise awareness. So that's an example that's right here in your backyards that I find quite interesting. But so in the realm of water management, we need to keep in mind that gender inequality in that realm actually reflects the gender norms that are present and the power relations that are present and interwoven in the larger social, political, and economic context. But we also should keep in mind that despite constraints on women's roles and participation, women are in fact leading change. A couple of examples I will be telling you about in various facets of water use, water management, and water governance. But first I want to maybe engage in a short pop quiz with you all to ask you what you actually know about the role of women in water, and in particular in water governance and in productive uses of water. So let me ask you, around the world, women are predominantly responsible, at a rate of 90%, for preparing food for their families, right? That comes to us as no surprise. How much of that food do they grow? So even though I can't see very well because of the lights, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many think it's less than 30%, more than 30%, or more than 50%? So how many of you think that it's less than 30%? That's, yes, globally. As a global average, how much of the food is grown? So I see a few hands back there who think that it's less than 30%. How many think it's more than 30%? And how many think, I see more hands, and how many think that it's actually more than 50%? I'd say it's about even between those who think it's more than 30 and those who think it's more than 50. In fact, around the world, women grow more than half of the world's food, and in some parts of the world, it's more than 80% of the labor that's provided by women. So that's really a crucial element to keep in mind, which leads us directly then to one of the key constraining factors on the access by women to water resources, which is the issue of land tenure, right? Land tenure is a crucial aspect of income and security for both men and women, and it also affects access to water resources. So of all of the countries in the world, how many legally protect and promote men and women's equal access to ownership of land? Do you think it's 5? Do you think it's 28? Do you think it's 73? Do you think it's 107? How many of you think it's 5? How many of you think it's 28? I see a couple of hands. How many of you think it's 73? And 107? So I see a bit of hesitancy, but I did see the most hands around 28, which is absolutely right. Only 28 countries in the world ensure that women and men can use, access, and own land equally. So my last question to you has to do with the Dublin Principles that were established in 1992. The number 3 principle says, women play a central part in the provision, management, and safeguarding of water. And that called for positive policies to address women's needs and empower them to participate at all levels of water governance. Here we are 22 years later. What percentage of countries has a gender policy in their water ministry, do you think? 30%, 15%, or 60%? How many think it's 30%? How many, I see a few hands. How many think it's 15? And how many think it's 60%? almost no hands. So in a survey that IUCN's Global Gender Office conducted, it was found that only 15% had a gender policy in their water ministry, and only 35% had included gender considerations in their policies and programs. So what does this is 22 years after the Dublin Principles were established. So what does this all tell us? Well, first, we often associate women with domestic water usage and management, but under recognition of women's roles in productive water resource use allows the maintenance of certain sociocultural practices and governance structures that in fact impede women's secure access to the resource. Second, the restrictive land and resource tenure laws curtail productive opportunities for women, as well as, and this is something we don't often think about, their visibility in national and transboundary economies. And finally, national and local water governance frameworks are not evolving fast enough towards implementation of gender equality. So less women are involved in formal water governance processes. But in spite of this, in fact, women do play a prominent role in the productive use and management of land and water resources. I want to give you a short story about women in the Mano River Basin. This is in West Africa. This is an area, a sub-basin of the Mano River that's shared between Guinea and Liberia, and where there's been water conflict for decades. As well as more general conflict around resource use. And so there are really very grave peace and security issues in that area. Well, in these, there's two or three villages that share a stretch of the river and that are situated on either side of the border there between Guinea and Liberia. And the women are the ones who actually do the fishing and collect food for their families through fishing. And they found that they were sort of in tension and repeated conflicts because they saw that maybe women from the other side of the border were using more of the fish or capturing more of the fish, and therefore they felt that there was an unequal allocation and use of the water resource. So what did they do? They got together and they talked about the importance of using this resource and of sharing it in a way that made sense for their livelihoods, for their families, and for the welfare of their communities. Long story short, they basically set up a calendar and found a way for women from both communities, both sides of the border, to cooperate and use the stretch of the river on alternating days in order to allow each other and to allow people from the other communities to benefit from the resource. What's interesting about this is that that cooperative initiative, that collective action on the part of these women has also led to greater peace and security benefits in that area where those communities are in fact getting along much better. I haven't been asking you to change the visuals, I'm sorry. So we can go to the next, I have a few pictures here. We can go to the next one still. These are women on markets selling fish. The next picture, please. And so this was Marguerite from the Mano River Basin, and she is quite an advocate, not only for shared water resources, but also for peace and security in the region. If we go to the next story, this is Jessie Barra Laga. She lives in the Guascoran Basin, which is shared between Honduras and El Salvador. This is a basin where there are not, unfortunately, very good symmetric governance structures across the two countries, and so cooperation has been quite difficult. And yet they are dealing with many issues going from climate change to extremely rapid infrastructure expansion to fairly violent, and some of you may know about the violence in Honduras, which unfortunately does affect a number of people, and it can range from violence in cities to rural areas, and it often has to do with the use of natural resources or the construction of infrastructure around natural resources. Jessie has several women colleagues who are environmental advocates, and a couple of them were assassinated in the last 2 or 3 years. She has developed as a result an incredible resilience, but also motivation to keep working at getting people cooperating in this basin and negotiating, and also showing that communities can in fact motivate the private sector to work in a much more responsible way in the basin where they live. So she's been really quite an interesting advocate, because she has adopted very tactful negotiation skills in her advocacy, in the work that she does with communities. And also, her work stretches all the way to migrant communities living in the United States who come from that basin, and to whom she appeals to raise their awareness and to get them to send resources back into the basin so that they can all invest in resource management. So what this tells us is that women are demonstrating, and the story of Jessie and the story of Marguerite, they really tell us that women are demonstrating innovative ways to do things. They are holders of knowledge around water use and sharing, and they can play major roles in knowledge dissemination, in awareness raising, and finding new ways to resolve conflicts around the resource. And yet, the knowledge, the skills, and the experience of these women is often under-recognized or underestimated. I should probably wrap up soon. But I did want to mention the Water Integrity Capacity Building Project, which is also supported by the Swedish government and implemented by a number of partners in the region, supported by SIWI and also IUCN's West Asia regional office here in the region. And they've really worked very hard to develop processes in which women were able to take leadership roles to affect change in the awareness and in the use and in the sharing of water. So that's really, that's work that's quite valuable, and that is really spearheading the issue, I think, globally. And some of the stories that have come out of that work are real examples, I think, that can be used in other parts of the world. I'm running out of time. If we go to the next slide, this is Rinku Das. She lives in India. She lives in West Bengal, to be more specific. And in this region, the authorities have actually put in place a quota to ensure that 50% of women have access to local government office. She is 23 years old, and she is now in a position where she is providing leadership in her community in an official governance position. And she has been leading change, leading awareness raising, and also proposing new solutions in her community that revolve around livelihoods and transboundary water sharing between Bangladesh and India. So her case is also quite interesting, and I can tell you more about it afterwards because I don't want to take up too much time here. But I do want to mention that this tells us about the role and the potential of women in water governance. And, you know, we have to remember that there are assessments. There's an assessment from the United Nations World Water Assessment Program that show that women's involvement in the management of water resources and water infrastructure can actually improve efficiency and increase outputs. The World Bank did a study 20 years ago that also showed this. Evidence also indicates that women's participation in decision-making at higher levels has specifically benefited environmental policy, so that countries in which more women are in the parliament are actually more likely to set aside protected land areas and to ratify international environment treaties. So those are, you know, all very very compelling examples. And I just wanted to share those few examples and to motivate, hopefully, a discussion around a call to action. It's a call to action for policymakers, for researchers, for stakeholders, for every one of us who is actually a water user and who can make a difference at these different scales. Water governance is embedded in a number of complex, intertwined economic, sociocultural, and political processes. But as we've seen, the leadership and change that women are making in water governance potentially also has the potential to change the wider processes and the wider gender inequities that exist in our societies. Thank you so much.
No, he's in my